On June 11th, 1938, a man named Hugh Lord lit a cigar at the front gate of his house in St. Thomas, Nevada. The new Lake Mead had reached his porch the night before. He drove out. He never came back. 84 years later, in 2022, the foundations of that house stood dry again in the desert sun. St. Thomas existed before Las Vegas existed. 45 Mormon families built it in the swamp bottom of the Muddy and Virgin Rivers in 1865. The federal government drowned it in 1938. The drought brought it back. Brigham Young dispatched the founders in 1865. The Muddy Mission, the Muddy River, and the Virgin River meet at a confluence 60 miles northeast of where Las Vegas would later stand. In 1865, there was no Las Vegas. There was a bottomland the Paiute had avoided for generations because of the fever, and the Mormons did not avoid it. I went through the Daughters of Utah Pioneers archive in St. George. Of the 45 families who came to the Muddy Mission in 1865, 12 are listed only by the head of household name. The wives and the children mostly went unnamed in the official records. I sat with the ledgers across 2 afternoons. The names that were given, I copied. The names that were not given, I left blank. Daniel Benelli came down out of Utah with the Muddy Mission, Swiss Mormon convert. He took up the only practical ferry on the Colorado River for hundreds of miles of canyon country, the Benelli Ferry, and he ran it from 1871 until his death in 1903. 32 years on the water. If you were coming out of the Arizona Strip with cattle or hides or copper, you crossed the river at Benelli's Landing, or you did not cross at all. Hugh Lord was born into the second generation of the Muddy families. His people were already old at St. Thomas by the time the federal letters arrived. He was the last one out. If you care about the families who built the American West with their hands, the settlers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Westbound Archive right now. Hit the button. Come back. The first winter on the Muddy nearly broke them. The fever came up out of the river bottom in clouds of mosquitoes. The records I pulled from the Daughters of Utah Pioneers archive list children buried in the founding 18 months. Brigham Young's plan was cotton. The southern Nevada climate, he believed, would grow what the Confederate blockade had taken away from Utah during the Civil War. The cotton mill went up in 1869, built by Joseph Hancock under the Muddy Mission cotton experiment. The mill ran. The cotton was thin. The labor was thinner. The experiment did not hold as Brigham Young had imagined it would. But the town hold. By 1881, St. Thomas had grown to 500 residents. 40 adobe and frame buildings ran the length of the main street. A schoolhouse, a ward chapel, an ice cream parlor fed by ice cut from the river in winter and packed under sawdust. A post office, a telegraph line in later years. Children were born in St. Thomas who never saw their grandparents in Utah and never expected to. Here is what the federal letters did not say. By 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act had passed Congress. Hoover Dam was on its way. The Bureau of Reclamation began surveying the Muddy and Virgin River bottoms. The maps showed St. Thomas 60 feet under the new reservoir at full pool. The Bureau started buying out the families in 1935. Some sold for a fair price. Most did not. The federal condemnation orders went out in waves, building by building. The auctions ran through 1936 and 1937. The ward chapel, the cotton mill walls, the schoolhouse, the ice cream parlor, adobe walls sold for the price of the brick. Frame structures were dismantled and hauled 20 miles north to Logandale and Overton, where most of the families resettled. A few went to Las Vegas, a few went back to Utah, the rest scattered. Daniel Benelli was 32 years dead by then. He never saw the water come for the town. His ferry had been gone for a generation. The river crossing he gave his life to was already in the past before the town followed it under. But the Daughters of Utah Pioneers records show something stranger. Of the original 45 founding families, only a small fraction had direct descendants still living in St. Thomas by 1935. The rest had moved or died out across 70 years. The town that was condemned in 1935 was not the town that was founded in 1865. It was a small remnant of itself, a few dozen families holding adobe walls against the federal map. Hugh Lord stayed the longest. His mother was buried on the cemetery hill above the town. The federal letters came to his door 3 times. The Bureau offered 3 different prices. He took the third one only because the water was already coming up the street. On June 11, 1938, the water of the new Lake Mead reached the porch boards of his house. He packed the truck in the morning. He locked the gate behind him. He stood in the desert sun and he lit a cigar. The accounts in the Las Vegas Review-Journal from that week describe a man at his gate, smoking, watching the reservoir climb the steps of his porch. He waited until the boards were dark with water. Then he got in the truck and he drove out. He never came back. The water kept rising for 2 more years. By 1940, St. Thomas was 60 feet under. The adobe dissolved into the silt. The frame structures collapsed and were buried. The Ward Chapel walls went last. The schoolhouse roof was found by National Park Service divers years later, 65 feet down. For 64 years, there was no St. Thomas. Boats passed over it. Fishermen anchored above the foundation lines and did not know. The descendants of the 45 founding families scattered into Las Vegas and Salt Lake and the small towns along the Colorado. The wives and the children who went unnamed in the Daughters of Utah Pioneers archive vanished a second time into the second great forgetting, that is the reservoir itself. What happened in the drought of 2002 changed everything. The water of Lake Mead dropped 21 feet that year. For the first time since 1938, the foundations of St. Thomas broke the surface. Park rangers walked out on the dry silt and found the outlines of the ice cream parlor. By 2015, the drought had taken the reservoir down enough that the cotton mill footing was cleanly exposed. By 2022, the mega drought on the Colorado had pulled Lake Mead down to the lowest level it had ever held since the reservoir began filling in 1935. The whole town came back. I drove out to St. Thomas in the spring of 2023. The National Park Service has cut a gravel road that runs 3 miles from North Shore Drive down to the Old Town site. You can walk where the main street was. The foundation of Hugh Lord's house is the second one on the left, past the schoolhouse outline. The adobe is gone. What remains is the concrete footings, the river stone basement walls, and the cemetery hill above what used to be the floodplain. A park ranger I spoke with that morning told me that the visitors who come now are almost all descendants. 4th generation, 5th generation. They walk the streets with photographs from the 1920s, and they hold the photographs up against the foundation lines. They find their great-grandmother's porch. They find the schoolhouse where their grandfather sat at 6 years old. The schoolhouse outline is visible from above on the satellite maps now. The post office foundation has been measured by archaeologists. The ice cream parlor is gone, but the floor stones are cataloged. The cemetery still holds the bones of the founding generation. Hugh Lord's grave is in Logandale. I went through the Lake Mead National Recreation Area Oral History Archive, the interviews with the surviving children of the last St. Thomas families. Most of them are gone now. The ones who actually remembered the cigar and the water at the porch are gone. What remains are the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who walked the streets of the dry town in 2022 for the first time in 4 generations of their family line. I stood where Hugh Lord lit his cigar on June 11, 1938, cracked adobe at my boots, the reservoir line still visible on the rocks above. 84 years of water came and went. The town is back. The men who built it are not. One more thing. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to Westbound Archive. The algorithm buries old frontier stories unless enough people click. One click. See you in the next one.